Associate Professor of Political Science at Singapore Management University, where she teaches courses on comparative politics, gender, and international relations. She is also a consultant for Freedom House and the United Nations and a member of the International Research Council of the National Endowment for Democracy. Let us now have Dr. Bridget Welsh. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, Selamat Tahun Baru, the last day of Chinese New Year. Kongi Pachoy. I was going to ask Ms. Jit what the fortune for delimitation and delineation was for this year, but I'm not so clear. I think that it's going to be a rough year, I would say, rocky. As we move forward, looking at the relationship between best practices and delineation, these are really difficult questions that Malaysia is facing ahead. Before I get into my presentation, I'd like to take a moment to thank Tindak Malaysia, the Malaysian Bar Council, and all of the people here who helped to put the program together. I want to commend you for this very important effort of voter education and engagement on the issues that matter for Malaysia. You really deserve a warm round of applause. My presentation is reasonably simple. I'm going to take what Dr. Lisa Hanley did this morning and look specifically at how Malaysia, as I see it, conforms to the 5 golden rules in terms of issues of international best practices. And of course, for those of you who were a little bit late in getting here this morning, let me remind you what those standards are. They're pretty clearly here. Impartiality, equality, transparency, representative, and non-discrimination. And I want to emphasize that my remarks today, because we're trying to talk about how to get to best practices, are going to emphasize the things that are problematic, not necessarily the things that are strong and things that may be working. So in a sense, the focus of the presentation today is on what is in the glass as half empty as opposed to what is half full. This is by way of saying there are many things that are done reasonably well in Malaysia. And despite the emphasis of the remarks today, and I think I just want to highlight that because in order to be fair and balanced, one has to recognize that there are areas that have worked in the past, but there are areas, importantly, as was mentioned earlier today, that could be improved. Let me begin with the first issue, impartiality. Malaysia does not do well in this particular category. The EC, as is well known, is actually not seen as an independent and non-partisan body. You've had concerns with clearly articulated partisan ties. Some of them have been taken back in the media, some of them have continued in the media, but this is an issue of concern from the perspective of meeting international standards. The appointment process, all of the members are coming from government. There isn't seen as a consultative process and how the members might be appointed, or there is even no consideration of bringing in alternative voices into an election commission that is supposed to represent the whole country as opposed to just part of the country, or one particular party as opposed to many different parties. And this is a concern also because, and I'm going to skip a minute, is that many of the individuals who are appointed to the EC don't have experience in managing and dealing with elections. AKA, the professional capacity of the individuals seems to involve things like military intelligence or policing as opposed to specifically managing elections. And so I think this is a question from the perspective of meeting practices that are global. You do want to bring people in who know about elections, who understand how to do these processes in a way that is seen as professional. Another key dimension of impartiality that relates to the delineation exercise, of course, is the reporting structure of the EC. AKA, the reporting structure is initially to Parliament, but of course the grey lines in practice are often directly to the Prime Minister's office. And this means that you have a situation where the Prime Minister's involvement directly in the delineation process, the ability to review and the ability to change, are actually things that are seen as problematic. as was noted earlier this morning by Dr. Handley, that when you bring in politicians, and I mean all politicians, with all due respect to many other politicians in the room, you have a situation where this changes the dynamic in election redelineation in a ways that interests are protected as opposed to the people's interest as a whole. And of course, the question has to do with also with the Election Commission, with some of the reported links with elements of civil society that are seen to be less civil in their activities. AKA, there is a sense that it is actually responding to certain groups that are actually polarizing Malaysian politics as opposed to bringing the society together. And in fact, there is not enough engagement with civil society from a wide, broader spectrum in terms of the questions of partiality in relationship to the EC. This, I emphasize, is extremely important because when you have a body that is actually in charge of something like this important exercise that defines who's in government, what type of governance you're going to have, if you don't have an impartial actor, or you don't even have the attempts in some cases to actually move towards partiality, then it's very worrying. And what is problematic for someone like myself, who's been watching Malaysia for such a long time, is that the steps in the direction have been away from partiality and more towards impartial type of processes, at least in the comments that have been made. Although I would, to be fair to the Election Commission, there are some practices that they've tried to be more impartial, but in the area of delimitation, this is not one of them. Okay, I was going to put in pictures, but Mr. Wong told me that I had to keep the text big, and I realized that this is the only picture I left in, but I think it's important to show voters from all perspectives, and I had wonderful focus group conversations with these women, so I'm glad to include them. Now let me just emphasize a few of the things that we've seen, how impartiality has affected the historical practice of delimitation or delineation exercises in Malaysia. The main player who sets the rationale, who draws the boundaries historically in the exercises that have been done in Malaysia, have been the Election Commission. And the most problematic exercises, as will be emphasized perhaps today and tomorrow, have happened after 1969 election. And these redrawing exercises have actually been seen to have been done in inconsistent manners. In the sense that they adopt one rationale that is favoring the rural votes, for example, in the 1970s, and it changes in the 1980s to emphasize an emphasis on mixed seats. And in the 2003 exercise, the emphasis was on creating more safe seats. So the rationale has shifted. So there hasn't been a clear kind of sense that this has been done in a way that has actually been consistent and professional. And in that context, it seems and it appears that there seems to be a political rationale in the way the delineation has been organized, as opposed to a systematic professional assessment. And this practice, of course, makes the issues of delineation much more problematic. There has been extensive malapportionment, which of course my colleague, Dr. Wong Chin-Wat, will speak about afterwards. But there has also been extensive gerrymandering. And gerrymandering means moving the boundaries, as we've learned today. But in the case of Malaysia, the boundaries in some states have been moved in quite significant ways outside of traditional administrative boundaries, in administrative localities. And these are unexplained in a way, and inconsistent. And in some states it's done in some places, and in some seats it's not done at all. And this raises questions, because it's not so clear for questions of governance or even the questions for the voters. And so this gerrymandering and malapportionment is problematic. Malaysia is, in the context of Asia, on the worst side of the agenda in terms of the practices. There are other countries that do this, and I think Dr. Hanley was 100% correct. Every country has some aspect of gerrymandering or a history of it. But the reality is, it's the question of the degrees and what the impact are. And this impartiality factor comes into play. And I would like to emphasize that because of this awareness of these issues and because of the consistent practices of inconsistency and a lack of explanation and a clear, apparent political rationale, the implication has been a declining credibility of the body that's actually carrying out the delineation exercise. That means that the EC's standing as an organization has been weakening in terms of public perception. And this is not good for the EC itself or for Malaysia as a whole. The second standard has to do with the issue of inequality. This was the idea of one person, one vote. One woman, two votes, no. One person, one vote. And of course, I mentioned just now the issue associated with malapportionment. And the practice of unequal number of voters of seats is endemic within the states, in the individual states such as Perak or Selangor, and nationally. There is a public perception of malapportionment that it's predominantly East Malaysia versus West Malaysia thing, or a rural thing as in the northeast, the rural Malay heartland versus the urban areas on the west coast of Malaysia. In fact, as will be described in much more detail and much better way in terms of analysis and concrete data, it's actually in every single state. And it's actually much more complex than just East Malaysia and West Malaysia. It involves a systematic unevenness that exists across the country. And the way I would like to describe it for some of you is in ways that perhaps you can understand. Many of you come from families perhaps outside of KL. You might be from Kedah or from Pahang or from Perak or from Penang. And when you move particularly to the urban areas, what happens is that your vote counts a lot less than your parents did, who still may be back in the kampung, or your grandparents did, in terms of the weight of your vote. Because what's happening is, over time, there has been an impact that the urban areas have less political clout than the rural areas as a whole, even within states themselves. And this has had profound implications, not just for people who have moved to the cities, but for seeing people who've lived in the cities, but it's systemized an unevenness in the representation of ordinary people. You know, Malaysia faces a lot of challenges and questions of citizenship, well beyond the delineation exercise. But when it is institutionalized and codified in the practice of delineation, it creates unevenness that is actually much more troubling and deep. Because it actually gives people different sets of political power. And this has been happening delineation exercise after delineation exercise, and leaves negative implications. The argument, for example, in the 1970s was that they wanted to give the Malay community, and particularly rural communities in the Malay community, more power. But what's happening in the contemporary context is the Malay community in the urban areas like Selangor, or even in places like Butterworth, are actually been disempowered. So compared to their grandparents, they may have a third, or even sometimes maybe even triple the less amount of vote than they had compared to their previous persons, because of the systematic inequality that exists in the malapportionment process. And in fact, what is more troubling is that, besides an element of this, is that it sets a precedent that there is a sense that citizens in Malaysia are unequal from a perspective of the government. And it basically, it undermines the principles that Tan Sri just delineated earlier of human rights, of basic fairness for all Malaysians. So what we see is, by using malapportionment, we have a pattern in Malaysia that has strengthened the government's, incumbent government's electoral position. There is no question of this. If we look at the last GE13, where you had, as was pointed out earlier, 47.4% of the popular vote with 59% of the overall seats. This is an impact in part of the first past the post system, but it's also impact of the malapportionment that exists. It's devalued citizens, and it's discriminated against specific populations. Most people think about this in the context of racial politics in Malaysia. And traditionally, the paradigm of these issues were predominantly seen as racial. But the contemporary redelineation exercise is actually affecting all ethnic groups, and it is predominantly a geographic dynamic, where it is disproportionately affecting people in the urban areas. And it's also affecting those in the middle classes that are located, and disproportionately younger people who are migrating to the cities. So certain segments of the society are effectively being disempowered through these practices. This brings me to the issue of transparency. When you're standing up here, you can't see very much. You can sort of see people that are out there and so forth. So I kind of feel like this is what I'm looking at in terms of the redelineation exercise. It's really dark out there. There's some lines and numbers over there, and there's some people over there. This is the process in terms of the redelineation exercise has shortcomings in the area of transparency. There has been no real effort to educate the voters. Malaysian politics for a long time has been predominantly about elites. And I mean elites across the political spectrum, but particularly within the incumbent government. Now, this has changed over the last 15 years, and it's changing even more. And I think it's likely to continue as more people in society are actually becoming more politically engaged and more conscious of the rights that they have that they need to protect and advocate for. And we're now seeing changes in terms of voter education, programs like this. But traditionally, there has not been voter education. And if that voter education exists, it's either too technical or too patronizing that it really doesn't actually get across the process that is affecting ordinary people about how and why and where and what it means to what it's going to affect your vote and your political representation. There has been limited information on the tools that are used to actually carry out delineation. One of the most troubling things in the context of Malaysia has been that they are using an electoral roll, which is used for the GE13, which most people would have now, and studies have shown, has serious flaws within it. So, as a social scientist, when someone begins with a flawed sample, you're going to have a flawed process. Because it's not either representative or there may be voters that shouldn't be in there. And if you don't actually conduct a real serious, meaningful audit of the electoral roll in a way that is actually gaining credibility, you're actually beginning a process that is inherently going to be problematic and contentious. And the electoral roll, even as it is described and was given to candidates, doesn't have the full information of people's addresses, people's locations, and this is not clearly accessible to the public. The AC does provide it for some people if you buy it, but not necessarily in a form that people can actually use it and interpret it and do effective studies on it. Tindak Malaysia has tried to go very hard to look at these issues, but even the maps that are provided, they don't necessarily clearly delineate the lines in a way that is comprehensible, that is accessible. And some of the lines are more ambiguous. In fact, in the last general elections, maps were not fully given to the candidates. There was an expectation that they would have the maps from the previous election. So what this means is that the information to carry out the exercise is actually being held close to the chest of the Election Commission, as opposed to being shared and engaged. And this is not a transparent process, and it's also one that I think one could argue has elements within it that are problematic from the perspective of beginning an exercise based on something that is actually seen as flawed. There is and has been, in this process of redelineation, I think a practice of what I would call elite pact-making. What does that mean? That the main parties who have been involved in the redelineation exercise have been political parties. And this is across the political spectrum. So when a new seat is being created, or new districts, new constituencies are being demarcated or allocated, there are often deals made, including with opposition parties. And what's left out of the equation are ordinary voters. And so this process, I think, is going to change this year as more public awareness and more contestation of the delineation process and the competitiveness because there's less incentive for opposition parties to make pacts because the stakes are even higher. Previously, they would have less of a foundation, less ability to make to pressure for change. They now have a larger share in Parliament and many of the state governments, so it's going to be a contentious process. But I point out that the transparency has actually been also in how the deals that have taken place about this seat, that seat, this line this way, this way. And not all of this has been a deal of an even deal. In fact, often those deals are take it and leave it. We're doing it anyway. You leave it or lump it. You have to have it. But it is in the sense the parties that have involved have been predominantly political parties. And this brings me to a similar point that I'm emphasizing, is that there has been limited engagement with the public. And if it is engagement with the public, it's after the fact, as opposed to during and while and after. Right? It's sort of like you bake the cake is ready, and you either eat it or you don't. Right? You don't have a chance to help to choose what recipe and what the icing is and all the other things. I know I'm between now and lunch, so forgive me for the Now we move to the processes that do exist. Not many of them are effectively implemented. So, for example, there's a wonderful provision that allows for public hearings for voters, 100 voters, basically to actually reconsider and evaluate a particular process. But in fact, we don't see this being shared openly and discussed as options with the public in the past. And I think this is something that is a lesson in terms of the questions of transparency and how the process has evolved, at least so far. And let me just, careful with these words, cover up and conspiracy and all sorts of things, one never knows how it says that. But I want to point out, and I say this with good intentions to the PEC, which I know that they also do work under very difficult circumstances, and my comments are geared towards making them work stronger and making them more effectively. The perception is negative to the EC that they are hiding something, they're covering something up. And I think this has to do with this limited political reporting, public reporting and political engagement. And in fact, unfortunately, in terms of sharing information from the electoral or sharing maps, the trend has been towards more, should we say, hiding as opposed to more opening up. So the data that you do get, for example, in the electoral is missing more information than it was the last electoral roll or the previous sets of electoral roll. There's been recoding of data in ways that are incomprehensible, so it makes it harder to interpret how voter registration patterns have happened. This doesn't engender confidence at a minimum in terms of the questions of transparency. It's not so clear how voters are coded and why they're coded in certain ways. Some elements we know about the IC, other things are not so clear. And so there's contestation, unlikely contestation, over the delineation. And I think part of this has to do with not just the political stakes involved, but the lack of a basic following of some of the elements of transparency that can really make a difference. And I want to emphasize a point that Dr. Hamley made earlier, is that there is a need to build confidence in elections. You just have to look to Thailand to understand the potential. There is a real problem of polarization politically in this country, and credibility in the election process is essential for Malaysia's, not for questions of democratic principles, not just for questions of democratic principles, for issues associated with Malaysia's long-term stability and well-being, which of course we all are really well vested in and we care very deeply about. Let me bring me to the fourth issue, which is representativeness. As everyone knows, in the context of Malaysian politics and Malaysian political life, ethnicity is the dominant mode of perception of representation. And I recently wrote a paper, in fact last night, before I came here, and it was interesting because I was reading through all of the research on Malaysian elections, and I tell you, there's so much of it. And you know, it's still the dominant paradigm of the way people look at voting behavior. And we see still in 2013, Malays, Chinese, Indians, there are elements of voting patterns. But the ethnic groups also have a lot of differences within them. And I asked myself, what makes a Malay vote this particular way? What makes a Chinese person vote that way? Was it because they're Chinese, or was it because something else? Now, is it just because they were Chinese, or is it just because they're Malay? These are very, academic type of questions, but they're also very meaningful questions. I mean, in the way that citizenship and rights and the engagement of politics, is race the only thing that people are thinking about? I don't think so. Is it the way, but it is the dominant paradigm that has been used in the redelineation exercise in terms of sense of rights and sense of elements for different communities. And this ties into questions of representation. And I would argue and suggest to you that this is a very limited conception of representation. I can assure you that in my experience in Malaysia, not all Malays are the same, politically and otherwise, and not all of the other ethnic groups are the same as well. And you have to look at everyone as a human being as opposed to just looking at the ethnic component of who they are. And I think this is problematic because in the concept of redelineation and in the context of the institutionalized norms within the Malaysian political system, the delineation exercise is still perceived within an ethnic lens. And I think that is too shallow and actually doesn't do the citizens justice. That said, the practice has been to limit the representation of many of the ethnic minorities in the context of Malaysia. The creation of the federal territory is a classic example of what happened after 1969, where this was perceived as actually changing the representation of the Chinese community in the context of Malaysia. We've seen significant and actually quite troubling divisions of representation of communities in East Malaysia. When Dr. Hanley was laying out her screen of contingency as an element of keeping a community together, I was reminded of some of the concerns I've heard of Ketazans and Dusuns in Sarawak, who feel that their seats have been drawn in a way to divide the community as opposed to keep the community together. And there are elements we can see, if we look at the ethnic configuration, that the communities have been divided by these lines. So there has, especially with smaller minorities in the context of East Malaysia, but not just in East Malaysia, Orang Asli and others. We have division of Orang Asli between Perak and Cameron Highlands as a point of example. And so the principles of at least allowing ethnic representation of smaller groups and sensitivities to the questions of representation have been missing and have left scars in the practices. And in this context, even if we can acknowledge that the administrative boundaries had some rationale, one doesn't know that I'm Irish, so I have a little distrust of the British in these things. But in that context, we have, the movement of dividing communities seems to be happening from the perspective of moving outside of administrative boundaries. And this practice has become more common. So you're dividing communities that have already set up around administrative communities. Like Sagama is divided right down the middle in a very bizarre way. And even Bukit Bintang is divided in a strange way. I've actually taken the time to walk some of these lines. And you wonder why one neighbor is next to another person is in one constituency, and the house next door, who would be the brother, is in the other constituency. It doesn't make any sense, and you feel you have to really dance, and you don't see it when you look at the lines, but when you do get down into the local level, this is problematic in a bit. Okay. Non-discrimination. The last principle. This is a sensitive topic. And I know that there are lots of very strong feelings, and I respect them, and I respect them from across the positions, because I think all views, even the ones you don't like or disagree with, need to be respected, if not necessarily agreed with. And again, I emphasize the point that I raised earlier, is that discrimination is still largely seen from the context of ethnicity rather than citizenship. What about all the young people that are moving to the rural areas? And what does that mean for young people having less political power? because they have fewer seats in places like Penang and Selangor or Johor, in southern parts of Johor. Not the seats that are made are usually made on the east coast of Johor or in the north part, not in the place where the concentration of the voters are, although there were a couple seats, but not enough from the perspective of representation. And we see patterns that do not reflect well on the true spirit of Malaysia, which is a spirit of much more tolerance than you see in the media. And that ethnic representation of minorities seems to be weakening. And this, of course, is creating a lot of bad feelings and anxiety, and for some people, frustration. Now, I would point out this diminution of ethnic minorities is happening even within states like East Malaysia, where the sense that they're one ethnic group, in this case predominantly Malays, but are given power over other ethnic communities in terms of the allocation of seats into smaller areas and with less population. And you see this pattern, for example, in Sarawak. And it's not just in the delineation exercise, it's also in the allocation of the number of seats. And I point this out because delineation in the practice of Malaysia has been dividing Malaysia. It's not bringing people together. It has very troubling dimensions in terms of representation and discrimination. And ultimately, these types of practices that don't conform to international best practices don't reflect well on Malaysia as a country, which of course we'd all like it to do better, and it also doesn't reflect on the legitimacy of the government. If the lesson that the government takes from GE13 is that we have to use the redelineation exercise to strengthen our political power in a kind of polarized fashion, it ultimately will weaken itself. We've learned in the practices of redelineation in Malaysia that the rationale of today is no longer the rationale of the future. That 10 years down the line, political actors adapt and win seats. And unintended consequences of creating mixed seats help to contribute to 2008. So whatever they do and whatever happens now, you can't assume that you'll be able to adapt effectively and change it down the line. And what will be the implications of that? If you continue to follow a pattern that is divisive, that is exclusive, that is diminishing rights, these things, I fundamentally believe, backfire. I've closed my remarks. Thank you so much.